spontaneously combusting, we're going to go ahead and get started. Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to Gardening in the Panhandle Live. I'm your host, Daniel Leonard. It is a very warm Thursday, May the 30th here in Blountstown, Florida. We have an we have an awesome panel of experts here to help answer all your turf grass questions that you've sent us. So let's go ahead and meet our panel and get right into it. So we'll start with Dr. Unruh. How are you doing today, sir?
I am very well. How are you?
Doing well. Moving a little bit over to the east, we have Josh Chris, or I guess south.
Pretty much straight south.
Yep. And then over in Okaloosa County, we have Ms. Sheila Dunning with us today. Hey, Sheila. So we also have Julie McConnell and Beth Bowles helping us out behind the scenes. Beth will be monitoring the chat. So if you have any questions, feel free to type those out in the chat as we go along today, and we'll do our best to get to those as they come. But we'll go ahead and dive in. We're going to start with just some general turf grass questions before we get into some of our more specific topics like irrigation, fertilization, weed control, lawn renovation, that kind of thing. So we're going to start with Sheila. Sheila, I put this one out first because, as you know, our Northwest District Horticulture agents had a No-Mow March campaign the last couple of years. And this question is, does No-Mow March cause more problems in maintaining a good lawn than it helps?
Well,
that was an interesting question.
Yeah, the whole point behind the No-Mow March is to leave those things that are flowering at that time of the year for the pollinators. So you do really have to pay attention to what it is you're leaving behind. If these are going to be some very aggressive weeds, yeah, you could have some concerns that they are going to be given the opportunity to seed again. So you may want to be a little selective on some of that, but the weeds are there because the grass isn't real healthy anyway. So yeah, that's the biggest concern is improve the health of the grass. You will have less of that competition from those problematic type weeds.
Okay.
But if they're little annual wildflowers, not a big deal.
Yeah. Okay, good. That was a common question we've had this year. And I'm glad you mentioned the word health in your answer, because we're going to transition right into the next question. We're going to stick with you, Sheila. And the question is, what is considered an unhealthy lawn? What would you consider that?
Well, and I saw that some people, mentioned that they thought unhealthy meant that you were constantly having to put some sort of pesticide or in some sort of artificial introduction into there. No, just unhealthy is grass that is not performing at the level that it should. So it's not growing, it's not maintaining its color, and figuring out what that problem is. Is it that it's not growing in a situation that it wants to? Is it that the cultivation practices need to be changed? Healthy just means that it's functioning quite well on its own and looking pretty good with minimal introductions. So yeah, if you are having to throw a bunch of products at it on a continuous basis, you probably do have an unhealthy yard.
Dr. Unruh, would you agree with that definition of an unhealthy yard?
I think so. And I've been doing this thing for a long time. I started messing around in turf grass when I was 7, and so I'm about 50 years playing with grass. And I think we tend to, as people, we tend to do too much. Okay. And I'm not a big subscriber to the, do something 4 times a year or do something 6 times a year. I think that we probably could get away with taking a much more minimalistic approach in the urban landscape, and I think we'll be okay. And so I think there's a lot of folks that maybe get indoctrinated in that we have to do these programs, we have to do this, and then we get a little spring fever in there, and we run to the store and we buy something, and I'm just not so convinced that our lawns necessarily need that much input. So
good. That's good. That's good to know. It helps make things a little bit easier. And Sheila, one last question. We'll let Josh and Doc chime in on this one probably a little bit as well. Fertilizer and pesticide inputs aside, do lawns provide environmental benefits such as carbon sequestration? So there's all this, information and misinformation about how lawns are bad, but talk a little bit about some of the environmental services of lawns.
Well, and remember, this is still a plant. So it is still removing carbon dioxide and providing us the oxygen that we are breathing. And so a pretty small patch of grass is a huge introduction to your oxygen that you need each day as an absolute minimum. But outside of that, this is something that is reducing the temperatures in the summer, 30 to 50 degrees. I mean, that's significant. If you stand on the parking lot and then you go stand in the grass, you'll know that difference pretty quickly. That atmospheric cooling is so important, not just for the environment, but for us as the people in that environment. It is stopping erosion, so we have all of the soil, and it's building that topsoil as that grass continues to grow and break down. And while it's actively growing, it is pulling out all those pollutants. So some of them might be the ones you've contributed with your pesticides and your fertilizers, but it may be those that are coming off of other hard surfaces too. We know it has incredible potential for removing those chemicals and breaking them down into something organic that is suitable for the environment. But that huge biomass of roots underground, when someone's talking carbon sequestration, incredible potential to hang on to and pull those things out of the environment. So that's just the science side of it. If you go to the social side of it and you start thinking about, hey, it looks good, my house is worth more money, all the memorable events you can have on that grass. There's a social side to it also.
Awesome. So our next question, I am gonna ask all three of y'all this, and we'll start with Brian. The question is, what is the best grass for Florida? And that's gonna be an it depends question. I already know it, but just maybe give your opinion for most situations. What your recommendation would be there? What is the best grass for Florida?
It depends.
Brian.
It depends. So I mean, we tend to, we want to put one grass across the whole mix, and it really comes back to right plant, right place, right? And so, and for some situations, turf grass may simply not be the right plant for the right place. I mean, if you value your big old huge monster live oaks, right? Well, there's not a lot that turf grasses that are going to grow under those big, massive live oak trees. And so. But I mean, let's just go into, to an urban, city lot, and, the backyard maybe is shaded and the front yard is full sun. So it may be that the best grass for the backyard differs from the best grass in the front yard. Now, we don't like to do that. We want one grass that kind of fits all. Centipede's pretty hard to beat when you think about it from just simply a kind of low input. But if you're one of these folks that are kind of fixated on 4 times a year, 6 times a year, out there tweaking and messing and like to see sprinklers come on, then that may not be the best grass for you. The centipede doesn't like a lot of inputs. So I get that. That's probably the number one question I get. What is the best grass? And I think it really comes down to, do you want the better homes and garden, landscape that is, picturesque and is featured on the Southern Living cover? Then you may want to go with a manicured zoysia. If you want, that pasture, area that the neighbors and the kids and everybody's going to park on when the football team is playing on Saturday, then you may not want to go with the other grass. I mean, it really depends. I mean, that is.
It does.
It depends.
Hate to say it, but it sure does. So you mentioned zoysia grass. And obviously, in your opinion, is that probably the fastest growing market for turf grass is zoysia?
We've seen that in recent years. Yes, zoysia grasses have really made a splash. And there are really good zoysia grass varieties in the marketplace, and there are better ones coming down the pike. Zoysia grass is a very drought tolerant species, but it does it different. Most people, if we ask them the question, what does drought tolerant mean? It means it stays green with no water, but that's not zoysia. Zoysia tends to say, I'm going to persist through this drought by going dormant, and dormant zoysia typically goes from green to bluish gray to brown in a hurry. And it's just the mechanisms within the biology of that and the physiology of that plant that says I'm going to avoid that drought by going dormant.
Okay.
So zoysias, and then when a little bit of rain comes, boom, she pops back. But if you want to maintain a green, beautiful, well manicured zoysia grass lawn, it's probably going to take an irrigation input.
Okay. And that's part, I think that's part of what our question was asking. You know, we're going to touch on some of the specifics of turfgrass care here in a little while, but just kind of on that spectrum of low maintenance to high maintenance, in your opinion, where would zoysia fit in there?
Different maintenance. I don't like those terms low, medium, and high. I mean, I would probably put Bahia grass and, well, you think about
Bahia can be
grass,
very high because it grows so dang fast and tall.
it does. I mean, and so, you mow the yard, go get you, a glass of lemonade, come back out, and boom, those seed heads are there. And so,
yeah.
But some people find getting out on that ride mower and going back and forth therapeutic, right? And so,
Yeah.
and sitting on a mower driving around is not necessarily a lot of labor involved, right? You're sitting and you're driving. And so some people would define that as very low maintenance, even though you got to mow maybe more frequent to get that look. Versus out there hand weeding some things, to me, that's high maintenance. Anytime I've got to do manual labor, that shifts over to that higher maintenance thing. So
fair enough. All right. Final question for you, Brian, and we'll give you a little break and have some fun with our other panelists. Can I grow a lawn from centipede seed, or do I need to sod? And if so, how long will it take to fill in?
I tell people, in fact, I think I put I tweeted a picture, a Facebook picture the other day in our property. I tell people it takes 3 years to establish a lawn from seed and centipede. Now, this is an area that is probably 1.5 acres in size. It's underneath some trees that are all limbed up. I direct seeded it. There's no irrigation. I've never put any weed killer out there, and I fertilized it one time. And I'm just letting it crawl. And I mow it. And that's the best thing for centipede grass establishment, is just keep a mower on it. And so, but it takes about 3 years. And I don't recommend, people will get dead patches in the lawn and they try to seed into that. Well, the seed takes a lot of water to get it up, in that lawn situation. So they tend to, especially if they have sprinkler systems, they tend to set their sprinklers to run to water that seed. Well, then they end up hurting their existing grass because it's now getting overwatered.
Yeah.
And so I think it's a headache that is unnecessary. Just, in my opinion, go rake the dead stuff off, slop some sod down there. You can buy slabs of sod in the box stores, however many you need. You don't have to buy a pallet. You can buy or plugs, plug into that area.
So if you're establishing a lawn from centipede, sod's going to be more expensive, obviously, but it's instant gratification. Centipede probably cheaper, but you got a time investment.
Yep.
Got it. Excellent. Sheila, let's go to you. What choice of grass? Brian mentioned that obviously the turf grass that you choose for full sun and shade, a little bit of shade, is going to be quite different. So what would you say would be the best choice for a grass for a partly shaded lawn, or maybe under a large tree with high shade? Obviously, heavy shade from a live oak is going to be tough, but with that higher shade or partial shade, what can we do?
Well, but is that tree going to keep growing? Absolutely. So if you think long term, you really need to have a shade tolerant grass, not something that can survive now, but in 5 years it's going to be declining. So if you have to have grass there, look at the St. Augustines, look at a few choices in the zoysias, and pick from those as to which textures you like. But again, 10 years down the road, the odds are neither one of those is going to be fully functional. So you may want to start off right off the bat and create a landscape bed around that tree with some sort of alternative shade tolerant ground cover, short growing plant, so that you don't have to keep reworking that area.
Yeah.
Yeah, I know. Just like Dr. Unruh mentioned, yeah, he put the centipede out there, limbed up the trees. Okay, and that'll be fine. But long term, what's going to happen is you'll have less and less. So depends on how long you anticipate being at that house. And do
That's
you
fair.
care about the next person who inherits it or not?
That's valid. So that's
Here on
good.
the research center, we have huge live oaks out front.
Yep.
And the center was established in 1947, and then these fine textured, it's probably emerald zoysia that's growing out there under those trees because it was introduced into the 50s. And then down by my lab, one of my former technicians plugged. We did a lot of chinch bug work, and we'd bring plugs of St. Augustine back, and he would go out there and plant those plugs, and they are just taking over. But that zoysia has been growing out. It's never been fertilized that I know of. There's no irrigation system, and there is a solid ground cover of a fine textured zoysia, and then down by the lab, St. Augustine grass, and it's perfect. I mean, and there's just almost no input.
Okay.
It's mowed with a bush hog. I mean,
And that's a good point. If you are going to have turf in those spots, you definitely are going to want to pull back on the maintenance for sure, and you don't need all those heavy inputs.
Mowing higher, but as Dr. Unruh just mentioned, the cultivar matters. So learn what your supplier can offer you and learn which ones can take it and which ones can't.
No doubt. All right, Josh, we saved you. You're
Yay.
up to bat here. All right, so got an interesting question for you. What type of grass would you recommend for, a meadow area, natural area type thing that's going to be allowed to be unmown or just occasionally mown? What would you do in a situation like that?
You're going to want something in terms of turf grasses anyway. You're going to want something that's just really low maintenance. And I think Bahia is probably or Bahia, however you pronounce it. I think is probably the lowest maintenance turf grass we have. I mean, there's a reason that they throw that out on the roadsides here. It's because you don't really need to do much to it. And so if you're going to be out away from your house where you're not going to have your kids running around in it, and you're not going to have the ability to water it, and you don't want to be out there fertilizing it, and you don't want to be out there. We would have to go out there and mowing it occasionally, but if you want to kind of let it go, you can. I think Bahia is probably your best bet for that.
All right, excellent. Thank you, Josh. Sheila, I know you've done a little bit of work in this and in your academic and your extension life. What are your thoughts on bee lawns or encouraging pollinators in your lawn? How do we do that?
Well, even your centipede grass, when it goes to seed, will attract pollinators. So looking at what are the things that will flower that will attract them, and again, not become a massive weed problem. So I know there's an individual who is not interested in clover, but it's a pretty good option to let that, and it will also help to fix some of the nitrogen, reduce your fertilizing. It goes away as we get hot, so it's not like you're having to spray to get it out of there, but it'll come and go through those cooler months and provide that for the bees, especially at a time that they don't have the opportunity to find a lot of other food otherwise. So yeah, you can certainly do that. And again, looking at how much space can you devote to that? It doesn't have to be your entire yard. It can be perimeters, it can be flower bed edges, wood line edges. If you are adamantly opposed to having that, meadowy look as your front lawn, pick a different spot.
Yeah.
And allow those things to come in. We've seen many things that have been able to get established. Clover's just the first one that is super common. And you got the reds, the whites, the little hop clovers,
Yeah.
yellows.
There you go. Thanks,
Mhm.
Sheila. That's a really good answer. I think that'll be helpful to that person. Brian, this is a good one. Back to maintenance a little bit. How often should you aerate your lawn? And why would you want to aerate it? And then if you choose to do so, what's your preferred method?
so not the little spikes that come on the bottom of flip-flops. They really don't do any good. Our sandy soils do compact. And a lot of people think, especially if they're, kind of transplants from up north where we core aerified our clay soils often. Down here, I think it really depends on what is the use of that? I mean, are there traffic patterns, where vehicles are driving or kids are playing? Then I think we want to poke some holes on a fairly frequent basis. Frequent for me is maybe every other year. And then if you have zoysia grass lawn, that frequency is probably much more important. And then, a tine, is a half-inch tine, and then just lots of holes. I mean, don't just run the machine. You can rent these things now, but don't just run it one pass. Run it multiple passes in different directions, and in those trafficked areas, even more in those areas.
Okay, excellent. Thank you. Shed some light on aerifying. Josh, we're going to go to you, and we're going to switch gears to lawn irrigation a little bit. Just some general terms. What, in your opinion, is the best way to maintain a healthy lawn in our hot summers as it relates to irrigation?
Well, as it relates to irrigation, we see a lot of people overwatering, believe it or not, even in our really hot, humid summers. Nobody thinks about, because all they think about is that it's hot and plants need water when it's hot. Well, true to an extent, but we're also extremely humid. And so your water is going to move through your plant based on the weather conditions, essentially on the leaf or the blade, in this case, of that plant. If it's really humid, there's not going to be hardly any water movement. So if you keep throwing water at it, every time you think it needs it, you're just building up the water that's in that soil and you're killing back the root zone. And so you really shouldn't do that. What you should look for instead is for the grass to tell you when it wants to be watered. And you're going to see those leaf blades fold in half, and you're going to see the little bit of a color change, and then it's not going to pop right back when you step on it. And if those three things are happening, then you need to irrigate, but you really only need to irrigate 1/2 to 3/4 of an inch. You don't need to go more than that. And now that does involve you understanding how much your system puts out, which a good way to do that is you put some cans out there, you run it for 15 minutes, and then you go out and you measure. That'll tell you two things. It'll tell you whether or not that zone is being covered completely, and then how much water is being put out throughout that zone. You can use that to sort of hone in your irrigation system, and you can use that to better irrigate. And if you're better irrigating, you're going to have healthier grass.
All right, excellent. Sheila, Josh mentioned the amount that we need to water. If you were to go to a homeowner's house, and one of the main first things we ask is, how much do you irrigate? And they're like, well, I run it for this long, right? So we don't really know. Long is not an amount of water. So tell us how we measure the volume when we're dealing with the irrigation system.
All right, within that one individual zone, a random placement, 10, 12, 15, more than a couple, that is what I'm trying to say, of shallow, straight-sided containers, sandwich box, cake pan, tuna fish can, that sort of idea, and run the system for a set period of time. If it's already set for 30 minutes, let it run for that 30 minutes. But then go out and look at each of those individual cans. Like Josh mentioned, you'll know where you might have something not functioning, a nozzle that's clogged or wearing out because I don't have any uniformity in any of those cans. But literally take a ruler, stick it in that can and measure how much it is. Now you will have to average what you're seeing there. So again, you can gather them all up, divide by the number of cans, okay, and see what your number is. But in that length of time, we picked 30 minutes for this example. If it was delivering an average of 1 inch of water, you're way overwatering. You can cut your time in half. You only need that 15 minutes to maybe 20 minutes to get that 1/2 to 3/4 of an inch. It's a pretty simple calibration technique, and if you don't want to mess with the cans and the rulers and all of that, you can use a bunch of little rain gauges. There's lots of devices that would already be measured for you. But it does take an effort, and you do need to do each zone separately to see what each of those is performing, because it is not, all 7 zones will be running the same length of time. Ones in the shade may not need it. Things in scrub beds versus lawn beds are going to be totally different.
Awesome. That's super good information. I encourage everybody who has an irrigation system to take Sheila's advice there and do that. Brian, we're coming back to zoysia grass here for a minute, and I know this is going to be in It Depends too. The question is, how often and for how long should zoysia be watered during the summer when it's vigorously growing?
So I think when we, what was just described by Sheila and Josh, I mean, it doesn't matter whether I'm going Bahia grass, Bermuda grass, centipede, zoysia, whatever it is. Now, what happens, so that number really, that half inch, 3/4 inch, that number is pretty consistent from the zoysia and the St. Augustine. I mean, but what happens with zoysia is it tattles on you because of the way it goes in, it expresses that drought avoidance that I
Right.
mentioned earlier. Well, you can see non-uniformity in a hurry in a zoysia grass lawn. I mean,
Okay.
if you have a head that's not turning quite right, or a head that's stuck, it is it sticks out like a sore thumb. Non-uniformity in zoysia is one of the bigger challenges, and so that half to 3/4 is pretty darn consistent. Again, regardless to which grass you're.
So we need to kind of get away from this thinking that zoysia or some of these other grasses that we think of as high input use more water. They don't really.
No.
Awesome. Very good. Very good information. A little myth busting there. I like it. We'll stick with you, Brian. We're going to switch gears to fertilization a little bit. As soon as that weather warms up a little bit in the spring, people are hopping down to Lowe's to buy the fertilizer. So we've been in that mode here for a month or two. So let's talk about it. The first question is, and you've already answered this in your own yard a little bit, do I have to fertilize and apply pesticides to have a healthy lawn?
No. I mean, it's like, we like to use this, well, this grass requires X amount. No, it doesn't. Here's what plants do require, just like you and me, our dog and a cat and a horse. Okay, all living organisms require nutrition. Okay, and so then where did that nutrition come from? For us, we're going to eat a steak, or we're going to eat a salad, or eat ice cream. I mean, you're going to get some nutrition from that. Where do plants get their nutrition? Well, fertilizer is but one source of nutrition, of the nutrients that plant needs. And so if you've got a good soil, heavier soils, north end of many of our counties versus, the beachy sands on the other end of some of our counties, many of our old soils that have organic matter probably have sufficient levels of nutrients in them that we don't need to necessarily fertilize, especially when you think about a Bahia grass or a centipede. Those are plants that require less nutrient, right? And so there are plenty of lawns, centipede and Bahia lawns, that are never fertilized and do just dandy, right? You get sandier soils that have less nutrient holding capacity, then the need for supplemental nutrition, fertilizer, goes up, right? If you're incorporating compost, then you are providing nutrition. It's just not called fertilizer. It's called compost, right?
Yep.
And so that to me is the bigger issue, is what inputs are there already? Is it coming? Do you have good healthy soil or not? Are you composting or not? And then we start looking at adding nutrition in the form of fertilizer.
Awesome. That's a really good answer. I appreciate that. You just kind of segued into the next question there. And the question is, how often should lawns be fertilized? But maybe we should kind of reframe it by, depending on the turf grass and depending on what the person wants to use the turf for, just maybe give some common scenarios and what would you recommend in those?
So we tend to look at kind of depending on thing. So we have the aesthetic. How does it look? How is it performing?
Yep.
So for example, centipede grass is genetically a yellow-green grass. Okay, so if we're out and I go see and look at a lawn, if a centipede lawn is juiced up dark green, I know that too much is being added. I mean, it's just that's that simple.
Fairly common.
Empire zoysia grass tends to be a gray or green color, right? And so if I go see a zoysia grass lawn and the homeowner's telling me, man, we got to mow that sucker every 4 days, probably getting a little bit too much, right?
Yeah.
And so when, it kind of comes back to matching the expectation of the grass.
Yep.
If you've got, 27 dogs and 16 kids playing in your backyard and they're just running it ragged like it's a lacrosse field, might need a little bit more input because we have to grow and recover from the injury that is that grass is receiving. So then we increase a little bit. If it's, the cat walking across the lawn occasionally and it's growing fine, and you mow it every 7 days or every 10 days, then we may not need a lot of inputs. So
Okay.
it's one of
There's
those
a great,
depends.
yeah,
I'm not,
100%.
again, I'm not a fan of, whoop, the calendar says it's time to go put some fertilizer out. No,
Definitely.
it's biology. None of us operate off of calendars biologically. Well, that's not quite true.
That's and you know, it doesn't matter how much you fertilize your grass, like you mentioned, you're not going to change the genetics of that grass. It's not going to happen. So it's just the way it is. Brian, we got a question in the chat that came in a minute ago that I want to get to that I didn't have on our pre-sheet here, and that is a question that we do see from time to time in the Panhandle. It's not super common, but that is someone with a very high pH soil in their yard. What would you do turf grass wise, or what would you recommend they do if, you know, they're purchasing a new house, new construction, something like that, and you're looking at mid 7s, high 7s, low 8s? What can you do?
Well, you can not buy it or move,
There.
which may be easier than trying to change a pH.
Okay.
Going down's really hard. Going up's not quite as difficult. And so in those scenarios, the management just changes. And the species grass. So if we're trying to grow centipede grass in that high pH soil, that's just kind of a definition of insanity. I mean, we're gonna struggle to do that. There are other species that tend to do a little bit better in those higher pH, and so St. Augustine and Azoysia is going to tolerate those higher pHs better. And so, but then that comes down to an economic decision. You know, do I want to spend the money for those other grasses? And it's not just the upfront cost. You know, it's probably a little bit extra water, maybe some additional or different nutrients that are there.
Okay.
So
Move if you can. No, but it's an option.
that used to be my response to ground pearls. You know, it's just easier to move.
And we're going to get to that in a minute, so save that thought. Josh, the most common thing I see every spring when people start fertilizing their grass is I go to their house for a site visit and I see a couple bags of Scott's Turf Builder, and it's what, 30% nitrogen, something close to that. And so I see people causing problems with just a lot of nitrogen fertilizer out there. And so the question is, my yard is centipede grass. What do I fertilize it with? We know it's low input, but is there a product that, in your opinion, is a little safer from that perspective? And we'll also probably get Sheila and Brian's perspective on that if we need.
Yeah, I never really look at the product per se. You know, those 3 numbers on every bag of fertilizer refer to nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. But how do you know how much of that's already in your soil before you ever buy a bag of fertilizer? And you may not need phosphorus in particular. You may not need it at all. So the best way to pick the best fertilizer for your lawn is to actually get it tested. And we have a number of ways to do that. If you get into your extension office, we can help you with that. But you really need to know what's there before you decide a bag of fertilizer to buy. And now all of our documents at IFAS will give you the nitrogen levels right there, the nitrogen recommendations right there in the bag, because they don't really test for nitrogen. It's too loose in the soil. It goes away too quick. By the time you took the sample, sent it, and got it back, the level will be different. That's why they don't test for that. But if you go based on that and you know your soil and the other stuff that's going on in your soil, then you can get specialty fertilizers that are going to match what your soil has and what it doesn't have. And the whole idea is to put what is potentially that grass needs there, so that when grass does need it, it's there to have it. And like Dr. Unruh said, there's a number of ways to do that, and you might not necessarily need to do that at all.
Very good. Doc, and one of my philosophies has been with centipede grass, folks that grow that in their lawn, is that generally the lower the number on the bag, the safer it is, just because it's easier to not screw up. Would you subscribe to that method for the average homeowner like myself?
Yeah, I mean, if you're, yes, I mean, and
it's just easier to put out too much nitrogen with a 30% nitrogen product.
Absolutely, and so, in fact, and I have made that exact same suggestion. I mean, if we want to think about environmental impact, you know, if you've got a product with 6% nitrogen versus a product with 46% nitrogen, and part of it feeds into kind of some, you know, we have this by human nature, we say, you know, if a little is good, a lot is better, right? And for you to put, if you got a bag that's 46% nitrogen, it's going what 8 times as far as a bag that's got 6% nitrogen. And so if you're one of those folks that subscribes to a little bit is good, a lot is better, then go with a low analysis fertilizer.
Fair
Because
enough.
you can scratch that itch, a little, a lot's better than a little, and then we're
Yep.
not going to hurt the turf or the environment.
Excellent. Sheila, this next question reminds me of my own yard. I've got a little bit of Bahia, I got a little St. Augustine, got a little centipede. If you want to fertilize and water that, is a mix like that going to be a problem?
Again, knowing your irrigation system, if you have one, is going to be critical, because you're going to have to go with which one is drying out first, and that zone is going to have to be watered more than others. So see where you are with zones and where those transitional areas are. Same thing with fertility. You may be fertilizing other areas different. Hey, I have to fertilize front yard, but I don't have to fertilize the back. Side yard, we'll ignore it completely. Okay. But it depends on how all that's working, and they're growing in because the conditions for that particular grass type are more favorable there. Is it sunlight? Is it mowing? Is it water availability? The one that's the happiest is the one that's going to win there. Is
Every
it a
time.
problem? Not really. I can't say that. I don't know of somebody that at least has that intruding from a neighbor at the very least.
Yeah, no doubt, no doubt. Super
So
common to
it's
have
just
that
a
mixed.
matter of managing. But if it's got everything from Bermuda to St. Augustine, unfortunately, you're going to have to kind of mow it at the St. Augustine height,
Yeah.
so that you don't decline in that area, or you're moving your mower blade up and down as you go from one to the next too. So depends on how much work you want to put into it. If you're
No
willing
doubt.
to be that selective, great. If not, go by whichever grass type needs the most, and
All right.
everybody else is going to have to go with that.
Do the best they can.
Yeah.
All right, Josh, we got a question here about clippings. Should you or do you normally encourage folks to bag clippings, or would you return them to the grass? And kind of what situation might you do one or the other, particularly as it relates to zoysia? Again, zoysia's getting really common.
Yeah, so we would always recommend to leave it on there as long as you're not leaving hedgerows, as long as you're not having to go back and bale up your hay later. Then you're fine to go ahead and leave the grass clippings. If you mow and you can barely even see or not see at all the grass clippings that you've left, go ahead and leave them. When we talk about that soil building capability of our grasses, that's a big part of it, is leaving it there. And then that just adds organic matter and allows water retention and nutrient retention and things of that nature. And it's going to compost down, and it's going to become a part of the soil and really build that soil pretty well. About the only time you would want to bag them and remove them is one, if, like I said, if you have too much and you're going to have to go back and bale up some hay later, then just go ahead and get it off there to begin with. Or if you're getting a lot of thatch buildup, particularly with zoysia, if you're starting to get a whole lot of thatch, then you may consider taking some of that off of there until you get your thatch issues controlled, and then you can go ahead and start leaving it again.
That's a really good, thorough answer there. I appreciate that, Josh. Josh, we're going to stick with you, but we're going to switch gears a little bit. We've done irrigation, we've done fertilization. That leaves weed control, one of our favorite topics on Gardening in the Panhandle Live. And so this first question is more about kind of overarching, is weed control, is using pesticides, is that harmful to the environment if they're done properly, or can controlling weeds be beneficial in turf grass setting?
It can be harmful, but that's if your solution to everything is 10 gallons of atrazine, it's going to be harmful. If your solution to everything, actually the best way to control the weeds in your grass is just to make sure that your cultural practices are appropriate for that grass. Keep that grass stress-free, keep it mowed at the right height, keep it watered properly, keep it fertilized properly, and it should be stress-free, and it's going to grow in and it's going to prevent most of those weeds anyway. It's actually kind of funny whenever somebody talks to me, particularly about dollar weed, and I just tell them, well, you need to water less. So what do you mean? He said, well, it's an aquatic plant that you're giving it everything that it wants. So if you give the grass what it wants and deny the weeds what they want, being as grass is very low input, you're going to control weeds quite a bit just that way. But as far as the actual pesticides and herbicides are concerned, know what you have, know what the weed is, know what controls it, know what solves for it, and use the minimum amount that you can, and you should be fine.
Read the label, follow the label, right?
Read the label.
Sheila, I've never heard you say the label is the law.
Yeah, 110 times. The one that I'm seeing most people are missing right now is read all the fine details. How many times a year can you use it? And what sort of surfactant? Methylated seed oil has been my favorite word here lately.
Okay.
They didn't buy that, and they wonder why their weed killer didn't work.
Well, didn't read the label, didn't follow the label, right? So it's there for a reason. And Sheila, since we got you to chime in there, let's stick with you for this next question. One of the most common weeds throughout the United States, regardless of where you are, crabgrass. How do I get rid of crabgrass in my lawn? What say you?
Remember when that's going to germinate, okay? Most of them are annual, and they are going to germinate as soon as the soil just barely starts to warm. So, if you read the lawn handbook and it says, hey, put out your pre-emergence for grassy weeds, and it says March 1st, well, got news for you. Crabgrass germinates very, very early. So if you're wanting to prevent it, which is really the best option, there's not a whole lot of post-emergent options unless you're in some zoysia. So preventing it's your best odds. It's going to need to be fairly early in the year. Start looking for those temperatures to start warming. And I hate to say it, but in this area, it's lately over the last few years has been more like mid-January to early February,
Yep,
a month
100%.
earlier than most of what your publications say.
Yep.
So we start getting some few days there in the 70s after January 1st. It's time to think about it. There's several products out there, few active ingredients. Certainly our publications can provide you with that information.
Awesome.
It will depend on your grass type as to which one you're going to use. And of course, it's going to need to be watered in to get it down there and binding with that soil.
Can I
Awesome.
jump on this soapbox?
Yep.
Go for it.
So we're working with the public issues education team at the University of Florida, and we're just finishing up a survey of consumers. And it was shocking to me. The highest respondent was people using weed and feed products. And I just dumped my head because we in all of our publications, we do not recommend weed and feed products, especially for crabgrass control. We don't want fertilizer, weed and feed. So it's got the weed control piece, right? Weed killer, and it's got the feed piece, right? We don't want fertilizer in Northwest Florida. We don't want fertilizer on our lawns prior to about mid-April. And that's shifting a little bit maybe, but at present time.
Not in January though.
Not January.
Yeah.
But Sheila just said we need to weed control in January or February. So we've got to uncouple those practices. Okay. And there are a number of products, where you can see like a 007 with pre-emergence herbicide. Okay. That 7 is potassium. It's not going to cause environmental problems. It's not going to wake that grass up. It's just a carrier, a granule carrier that is delivering that pre-emergence herbicide. So we want to make sure that we're not doing, a weed and feed product that it's actually, where the first number on the bag is 10, 15, 20, 30% with a weed control. Don't do that. Don't do that. But our respondents are telling us that they all do it. And it's maybe why we have unhealthy grasses that we talked about earlier.
There you go. Oh, Brian, while we got you here, woken up, ready to go. You mentioned earlier the best thing to do if you have ground pearls is move. However, that's not practical for many people. So what can you do if you do have a ground pearl infestation? And beyond that, how do you know if you have one?
Well, they're fairly easy to see once you're there. And we go back, when I came to Florida 29 years ago, Larry Williams, Okaloosa County, took me out and showed me ground pearls. Back in the days when they had really harsh insecticides like chlordane and DDT, they couldn't control ground pearls. Okay. We don't have those products. I mean, those products didn't work on ground pearls. Today, we have much safer to use insecticides and we can't control them. What is fascinating to me is why they have become so prevalent. you go out into the lawn, they kind of have this serpentine pattern, especially in older landscapes, but we're seeing even in newer landscapes now. You got these areas that are kind of thinning out. Take a spade, scoop down in the soil, flip it over right on that fringe between healthy grass and unhealthy. Flip it over, and the ground pearl, it looks like a pearl, and it's attached to the root. And they're quite visual. And then when they're in their crawler stage, you'll see these hot pink little mushy crawlers. And again, they're hot pink. They're really easy to see. How do you control them? I don't think you can. Well, we don't have any chemical controls. Now, there are some newer insecticides that are systemic that we think they may be able to do a little bit of something, but they tend to be more problematic in those grasses that grow slow, right? So that historically it was always a centipede grass problem because grass grows slow. Those faster growing grasses tend to just grow a little bit, get out ahead of the ground pearls as well. But unfortunately, a lot of our lawn care companies have figured out that you can't control ground pearls, right? And so they're blaming everything on ground pearls now, and it drives me bonkers. I don't think they're causing all of our problems, but they definitely are causing some problems.
Okay. Yeah, it's an insidious little insect, that's for sure. Can't stand them. So Sheila, another a little bit easier to treat, but problematic nonetheless with weeds. How do you control a heavy infestation of doveweed?
Can we go to Brian's move?
Yes.
Just
I mean,
mow
it's a native plant. It's going to be here, right? So what can we do?
Yeah, and as he just pointed out, mowing frequently enough that it is not going to flower. Don't let it reseed. And if you have to pull out some sort of herbicide, you can do some spot treatment on it, but increase the frequency of your mowing. Additionally, look at your irrigation system. Often we see it in spots where the water is ponding a little bit there. Is it a little extra wet? Could I raise the grade with a little bit of sand and get it to drain a little better? That may help also. But it's more the cultural practices than it is pulling out the herbicides.
All right, Brian, I see you had something to add there.
Yep.
Yeah, don't try to pull it.
No.
It just makes it worse. It's funny. I think as a discipline action with my parents, I was a kid, is I'd have to go pull weeds, right? Which I don't think parents do that anymore. But I have since learned that was one of the worst things my parents could ever have done, botanically.
Weed wise,
yeah, weed wise. Because all the weeds that they were making me pull just proliferate when you pull weeds. Now, maybe that was their strategy: more weeds, more work, but
that's right.
Yeah,
Character building.
Don't forget when you're doing that mowing that there might be parts stuck on your mower. So do that area last.
There you
Clean
go.
up that mower before you go to an unaffected area. Clean up that mower before you put it away, because it's all those little vegetative parts that could easily root all over the place.
There you go.
Just like Brian pulling them and tossing them, right?
That's right. Josh, we're going to toss it to you. Zoysia grass, as we know, has become really, really common. It's a really good grass. It's a great plant, but as many people have found out, including the person that asked this question, it can also be a very aggressive grass and get into landscape beds and become a weed. And so, in your opinion, are there any zoysias that are easier to keep out of landscape beds, or maybe what's an overall strategy to keep those aggressive turf grasses out of your landscape beds?
About the best strategy you can have is to block them out of your beds as best you can. Use some edging or something of that nature to block them as best you can. Now, it's not going to be a deal where you put it right along the surface and that keeps it, because they will grow right under it. I'd probably bury those edgings 6 to 12 inches anyway, and then you probably want them coming up above the ground about 6 inches or so, and that way it'll prevent those zoysia grasses from even getting in there in the first place.
Brian, have you seen that in a lot of landscapes where this super aggressive zoysia just takes over everything when people don't pay attention to it?
I've seen that, and then I've also seen people who say torpedo grass is zoysia grass, because I often say that. But
yeah,
torpedo grass will take over those beds, and it kind of, in a mode setting, it looks a lot like zoysia.
That's true. It does.
And in fact, I've told landscapers, just tell the customer it's zoysia grass and move on. But no, I mean, manicured torpedo grass looks pretty good. I mean,
It really does, I have to say.
oh,
Sheila, are there any herbicides that won't harm birds? So we obviously want to be sensitive to the environment, the animals, and all that stuff that's living out there. What's the best way if you don't want to harm any birds? What type of herbicide would you apply? And that's I'm
Well,
kind of leading you, I guess.
okay, and when you start looking at the pesticide world, the biggest impact on wildlife is going to be from insecticides versus fungicides and herbicides. So it's not that herbicides are one of the biggest risks for birds. However, herbicides that, as Dr. Henri was just talking about, going out on a carrier that is a grain type appearance to a bird that looks like a seed. So if you are putting out granular herbicides, it is super important that they are watered in immediately in order to get that chemical off of that carrier. You don't want the birds walking behind you and feeding on it, because then it could have some harmful potential. We also start looking at how close to water are you? Because if these herbicides make it into water and now they are in the water that the birds are drinking, or that the fish that they might be consuming from those water bodies, that is a concern. So here we are back to reading the label again and follow the instructions. If you follow those instructions, there's not going to be a problem. But if it says you need to be 100 feet away from water, make sure you're 100 feet away from water. What's the most common herbicide we keep talking about? Glyphosate. Yeah, that one is labeled to be that far away from water. Okay. So really look at what those labels say when you're choosing a product. If it's granular, water it in. If it's a liquid, stay away from those water bodies. That's your best protection for your wildlife, regardless of what the active ingredient is.
Yeah, if I've taken nothing else away from Sheila in my 9 years of extension, it's read the label and follow it, right? So there you go.
It is rather eye-opening to folks that for the first time they sit down and actually do it.
Yeah, for sure. Josh, we're going to switch gears from weed and insect control a little bit to some lawn renovation. And it's an unfortunate part of life, but it does need to happen sometimes. And the first question here, if we've had most of our backyard basically now has no grass left because we killed all the weeds. We discovered that our lawn was, in fact, all that green stuff was mostly weeds, very little grass. What do we do at that point now that you've kind of weeded everything and you're not left with a lot? What would you recommend?
Well, you have a couple of options because all of our grasses here are creepers. They all like to kind of creep along the ground. And so it will eventually come back. Now you can help that if you get a couple of, you wouldn't even need a pallet, like Dr. Under said, go to the big box store and grab some sod, make sure it's appropriate for the environment that you're growing it in. You may want to vary up cultivars even in amongst the type of grass that you have and sort of give it a little bit more of a robust lawn. But cut that into squares and then sort of dot that out through your bare spots and make sure that you're watering in the bare spots and make sure that you get that grass established, and it'll creep in a little bit quicker. But our grasses here are creepers. And so as long as you're keeping the cultural practices for that grass type, it should grow back and sort of creep in. Now, it may take 3 years, but it will eventually do it. And so you may want to exacerbate that a little bit by dotting some sod out throughout the landscape.
All right. And keep in mind that there might have been a reason that the grass didn't do well there, and evaluate that for sure. Brian, we're going to switch it to you. This is common also. A lot of brown patch, large patch disease going around. In this question, large sections of my front lawn died last summer, diagnosed as large patch. How do we address this? So can you go back in where a large patch has been and resod? What would you recommend?
Well, first of all, why did that happen in that spot?
Exactly.
So large patch, typically it thrives in wet conditions. And we have a wet year, and there's a lot of rain, why did that spot, why was it wet? Is there poor drainage there? And so maybe we eliminate, that or fix that problem. Next, it could be, was it zoysia grass versus St. Augustine? I mean, zoysia grass is, Achilles heel is large patch. In which case, there's a susceptibility thing that zoysia grass just it's the magnet for large patch. But I think you address those conditions first, but can you go back into it? Yeah, I mean, it is, large patch does tend to come back time over time in those same areas, but maybe not quite as bad as say take all root rot does. Take all is ubiquitous in the soil and will just persist in those spots. But part of it is why that area? What was the condition that triggered it there? Was sprinklers running in the rain? Those kinds of things.
Okay.
So
There you go. Very good. Sheila, next question. And folks, we are wrapping up here. We've got 3 questions left. If you need to hop off, that's totally fine. Thanks for joining us. But if you can bear with us about 5 more minutes, we will be done. Sheila, we have a lot of bald spots, dead spots in our yard that we can't seem to get rid of. What would you do in those situations? I know you've seen that many times.
Again, it's part of that diagnosing and why do I have big spots? Is there something going on with the irrigation system? Do I have super compacted soils there? Is there absolutely no fertility left in that soil? So you're going to have to investigate what's not happening to let grass get established there. And if you can correct those, then you can introduce some new grasses. Yeah, unfortunately, it's going to take a little bit of work to go through that and look at it. At the very least, start with loosening up that soil, making sure that the water can get there. And then,
Spikes on your flip-flops.
and not with the flip-flops. Yeah, no. No, stand there with a pitchfork if you have to, but at least, turn it over with a bow rake, something to loosen that up. And then see that water gets to that area. And then experiment. If you install a new grass plug or piece of sod and it's declining, how is it declining? Do I have a disease at the root level? Do I have foliar problem? Are insects showing up on it? It's going to take some work. But now if it's an erosion issue and it's, you've got to get some vegetation cover over that. Yeah, look at some annual plants that you can grow there to keep from losing that soil.
Always an
Because we
option.
don't want to lose that. And if it's the winter, rye works pretty good. If it's the summer, you're going to have to look at some other challenges there.
There you go. Thank you.
Mhm.
Josh, second to last question here. If your centipede lawn is spotty with a variety of weeds, I enjoyed this question. That sounds like many lawns I've seen. Would it be better to just kill the whole thing off and start with a different species of sod like zoysia? What do you think about that?
Not necessarily. So zoysia grasses and centipede grasses, they kind of like to exist in different environments, and your zoysias like to be a little bit more alkaline. Your centipedes like to be a little bit more acidic. And what you don't want to do is think, oh, I'm tired of this grass. I'm just going to put something new down here and I'm going to put the grass texture that I like. And so you tear up all your centipede and you put down zoysia, and then you discover you now have to put down 50 pounds of lime every other year to make that zoysia even thrive, because your pH was so low that your centipede grass, where it would have had no inputs and been fine, now you've got to do a bunch of stuff to keep it alive. So zoysia is not necessarily the best replacement for centipede. So you're going to want to do a little bit of soil testing and kind of figure out what's going on in your lawn first. And then you're going to want to figure out why, just like we said a little bit ago, why is that centipede not thriving there? Are you overwatering it? Are you over fertilizing it? Are you mowing it at 3 inches instead of 2 inches? What's going on with that that's making that centipede not thrive would be the best question. But no, I wouldn't replace it with zoysia just straight out. There's a lot of testing that needs to be done prior to that.
Yeah, there's no silver bullet grass. They all have their advantages. They all have their disadvantages, and you just need to find the one that works best in your yard, like Josh said. Sheila, we're going to switch gears for the final time for our last question, and that's if you're dead set on trying a different species of plant than one of our turfgrass species in an area of your yard, the question is, have homeowners been successful at replacing areas of turfgrass with perennial peanut or other turf alternatives? And if so, what would be some of your recommendations on that? And we'll finish up there.
Yeah, and perennial peanut is a viable option for a vegetative cover that you can treat very similar to lawns. Again, cultivars, start looking at what's out there because there's lots and lots of them. And some will grow much taller and not get as dense. But those eco-turf type cultivars that are designed to do that, that's what they're being developed for, are very suitable. There is a issue with, yes, it's a creeping plant. So without any hard edges, if it doesn't run into driveway, sidewalk, house, it's going to intrude into flower beds, into the neighbor's yard. So there's some edging that would be necessary there. Not a lot of chemical options again to deal with that. So getting weeds out of it. But if you got a surrounded concrete border to it, perfect choice. As long as it's full sun. You can also do the sunshine mimosa. Now, both of which will turn brown in the winter,
Yeah, that's
both
my
of
biggest
which
drawback.
will encroach on other spaces.
Yeah.
So look at those restrictions. If it's a little shadier, we've had really good success with lyre leaf sage, very tight to the ground, then a flower spike on it, which can be mowed right off of there. If you've got some sloping areas and really dry areas, silk grass is a good option. Seen frog fruit. You'll see it spelled either F-O or F-R, frog fruit, has been a really good option for filling in those drier areas.
I've got an area near my well that just kind of stays wet all the time, maybe 20 feet wide, and it's a frog fruit yard right there. And that's just what wants to be.
Yeah. If you get your hands on, it's not always easy to find, but gopher apple is another really good option too that you would see growing on wood's edge in that ground cover situation.
Okay, got some good options there. Dr. Unruh, as our turf specialist, would you like to leave us with any parting thoughts about homeowner turfgrass care?
Homeowner turfgrass care, shut the water off, back off the inputs. I mean, over irrigation is probably our number one problem. Okay.
Yeah.
Just back off a little bit, and then for whatever, we have this human nature. We love this just completely manicured, not a weed in sight. I just don't think it, that is that necessary. I mean, get some weeds come in, let them. We're playing a lot around with, some of the plants that Sheila mentioned. We're playing around with mixing those with turf so that you bring ecosystem services from both of those things. And so, but I think that's it. I think back off the irrigation. And then probably many of those other inputs can be backed off as well. And it doesn't need what we're doing.
Okay, thank you very much. So that's going to do it for today's show. Thanks to everybody for attending and ultimately submitting your turfgrass questions. It was a blast chatting about them and answering those for you. Don't forget to fill out our survey, which Julie threw in the chat over there. It helps us know how we did and lets us know where we can improve. And be sure to join us for our next Gardening in the Panhandle live episode. It is going to be after the summer is over. We're taking a little summer break. So coming up in September, where we will be diving deep into all your fall vegetable gardening questions. And finally, for today's panel and myself, thank you so much for being here. And we'll see everybody next time. Have a good summer and good luck with your turfgrass care. Bye, guys. Thank you.